Julie Torres is a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is currently working on her dissertation research on the Puerto Rican diaspora in Orlando, Florida. Her project engages with feminist analysis of social justice within the Puerto Rican community. Let's welcome Julie Torres.
Of Puerto Rico Day for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm gonna read out my remarks because I don't want to go over time too much. But my dissertation project, as was mentioned, focuses on this very important migration, specifically in the Orlando metropolitan area. As I began my field work, I made the decision to focus on a very important sector of the Puerto Rican community, Puerto Rican women. Engaging with questions around the role of gender and social justice efforts in the community. Although I won't be presenting on that aspect of my research today, perhaps at a later date when I've done more of that data analysis, I do hope to share with you some of the aspects of my research today as it relates to this panel. So I'll preface my presentation by saying that I am a cultural anthropologist by training. So my talk might be a little bit different from the other panelists since I use more of a qualitative approach to my research. And I do that largely by interviewing people and attending events in the community. I hope to bring more of a human-centered perspective to some of the data that has been presented thus far. Because while the numbers are important and useful to my own work, I think it's also important to hear from the voices of the diaspora in their own words. So in the first half of my talk, I'm going to share with you some of those migration narratives. And in the second half, I'd like to shift gears a little bit to talk about the ways in which Puerto Ricans are mobilizing to improve the situation of both those on the island of Puerto Rico and in the mainland US. And just so you're aware, in order to protect people's identities, I use fake names. I avoid mentioning any names of organizations. Some of you might know what I'm talking about, but I'm being vague on purpose. So before I get into some of those narratives and moments, I want to briefly contextualize some of the history of Puerto Rican migration to Florida. Now, early migration to Florida was facilitated by various factors, such as agricultural ventures of a few business elite in the 1940s, as well as contract farm worker programs which were supported by the Migration Division of Puerto Rico's Department of Labor. In the years that followed, the demand for factory workers, military recruitment, and the growth of certain industries, such as the garment industry in Miami and the cigar-making industry in Tampa, brought more Puerto Ricans to the state. In the mid-1970s, Puerto Rican engineers from the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez were also recruited by NASA and began to arrive in Central Florida. However, migration to Orlando in particular picked up in the late 1960s. As real estate companies began to advertise properties in Spanish language newspapers in Puerto Rico, and later in 1971 with the opening of Walt Disney's theme park, which brought jobs and even further increased real estate speculation to the area. However, at this present historical moment, the economic crisis in Puerto Rico is characterized by over a $72 billion debt, as we've heard, and has led record numbers of Puerto Ricans to depart the island. So while Puerto Rican migration to Florida is not entirely new, there's no denying that there has been a shift in migration patterns and an increase in numbers in recent years. Now, while not everyone I spoke with migrated because of the economic crisis, several did migrate with the hopes of better employment, educational, and medical opportunities for themselves or their children on the US mainland. For instance, as we sat in the lobby of a local Orlando hospital, Juan, a nurse who migrated from Puerto Rico 4 years ago, recounted his motivations for leaving. Quote, "I left because of economic factors. With our professions, we work a lot, basically Sunday to Sunday, but the pay is almost nothing. You can hardly afford anything. And my wife is also a nurse, but it's not enough. There's no way we can live while working. Maybe if you're retired. The people who work, the taxes, the utilities, it's impossible." End quote. Lisa, on the other hand, a doctor who migrated 2 years ago, was fairly content with her salary. But because of the changes to the healthcare system on the island, she grew increasingly frustrated with her work-life balance. Quote, "What made me move was one night, I was doing my weekend call. There were 3 of us, so every 3rd weekend I was off. That weekend, I was working. I had to take call from the hospital and I would round. And I could see maybe 75 patients in one day. And then one night I was driving home. I talked to my husband and he said the kids were already sleeping. And I got so happy, thinking how good it was that they were already asleep. But then I just started crying. I thought I have to do something because I cannot say that I'm not happy, that I'm happy that I'm not going to see my girls." End quote. Shortly after that day, Lisa contacted a recruiter and found a job in an Orlando hospital where she was able to work half the amount of hours for the same pay. Yvette, a teacher on the island, shared the effects of the fiscal crisis on her own career in education. Quote, "In 2005, that was the time when things started getting tough in Puerto Rico. In education specifically, they started freezing many positions. Most of the positions in Puerto Rico were cut, or are granted with Title I funds, so they were cutting those funds, and my position was cut. I was a high school teacher at that point, and they sent me to teach kindergartners. That's when I said, you know what, I'm a high school person. That's my area of strength. That's what I love. Elementary, I did that for a year, but it's not my area. So that summer, I was so drained that I came to visit some friends here that had recently moved. And that summer, I started talking to my friends, and they said, you should apply here." End quote. And Yvette did. And she was able to find a job fairly quickly, although others I've spoken to did not fare so well because of the challenges of professional certifications and testing. Now, these 3 individuals represent just one subset of the population of Puerto Ricans who are migrating, professionals. Their experiences reflect the wide-reaching effects of the fiscal crisis. Many of them also face discrimination and stereotyping when they arrived. As Yvette relates, quote, "I think there's misconceptions about Puerto Ricans or the Latino community. I want to put myself as an example. I'm very well educated. I had great opportunities. So every time they say, oh no, they don't speak English. Listen, my English is from Puerto Rico. They don't speak English over there or they don't have the same educational opportunities. I had really, really great educational opportunities. So I think there's educating the community that we cannot generalize. People have this one perception. They just generalize it to the whole community. I think that's my personal motivation in what I do. This is what I used to tell my students when I was in the classroom. I represent Puerto Rico. I represent a group of people that strives to do the best, to go as high as I can. The sky is the limit. I'm not that mentality of welfare, or that kind of mentality that they connect a lot of Puerto Ricans to." End quote. "We want to send our kids to better schools. And at the end of the day, we want what everybody else wants." End quote. And I think that this last statement really captures what a deeply emotional experience migration is, especially for those who physically leave the island, but not necessarily leave it behind. And this translates into the efforts of several community members who are working to improve the situation of Puerto Ricans both on the island and in Florida. And I think this is a good point of transition, I think I have 2 minutes left, to introduce the idea of cultural citizenship, which is an academic framework that's used to think about, that I think is helpful to think about what's going on here in Orlando. Well, not here, you know what I mean. So now all of us in this room know that Puerto Ricans are citizens of the United States, but this idea of cultural citizenship extends beyond these so-called legal categories of citizenship. So now I mentioned that Puerto Ricans still face discrimination based on factors such as race, language, class, sexuality, and this can lead to the treatment of Puerto Ricans as second-class citizens. But given this, the notion of cultural citizenship helps us understand how individuals assert their right to be different and still have a sense of belonging. So I don't want to make this too abstract, so I'll give a few examples of how I've seen this playing out in the community in Orlando. So I'm briefly going to mention Pulse in a few minutes, so I also just wanted to let everyone know if they feel uncomfortable that they can feel free to leave the room. So one way that this plays out is through local activism. So just this past month, several community leaders and organizations came together to support another Puerto Rican community community organizations event in Kissimmee. The event, which included a march and a rally with several speakers emphasizing the effects of the fiscal crisis on their lives, sought to bring attention to the crisis in Puerto Rico stateside. But in many ways, it also served to stretch the boundaries of belonging to not only include Florida, but also Puerto Rico, through a deep investment in what's happening on the island. I've also witnessed the budding efforts of Puerto Rican teachers who are mobilizing to help those migrating to Central Florida learn how to navigate the system of obtaining teaching certifications and employment. Their gatherings are not only an attempt to improve the livelihood of Puerto Rican migrants, but also an act of community building, creating a safe space for Puerto Rican teachers to share their experiences and challenges. I can't really see the PowerPoint. So now I also have to mention this past election cycle. The knocking on doors, the push for voter registration, and the attempts to educate the public about the electoral process. Through workshops, events, even local radio shows. And this all speaks to the efforts to increase civic engagement and achieve more political clout for the Puerto Rican community. And many did celebrate successes with the appointment of several Puerto Ricans to office, whom they hope will lend an ear to the concerns of the Puerto Rican community. But I want to highlight the caravanas in particular. For those of you who don't know, a caravana is a method of campaigning in Puerto Rico that involves a parade of vehicles, often with the windows rolled down to the soundtrack of Spanish music, a hand on the car horn, and cars adorned with Puerto Rican flags. So the purpose of these caravanas in Central Florida was to encourage the Puerto Rican community to go out and vote. This pictured caravana from last October also brought together several organizations from across the community. Now, regardless of your party affiliation or whether you think it's an effective method or not, they're an important means of cultural expression that almost screams, we're here, we belong, and we need to participate in the political arena. Lastly, I wanted to say just a few words about the tragedy at Pulse. Initially, few media outlets reported that the shooting had occurred during Latin night, and that 90% of the victims were Latino. Fewer still mentioned the fact that 23 of the 49 killed were Puerto Rican. But as mourners gathered to grieve those lost, I think that the objects that they left behind were not simply expressions of ethnic identity, but also a claim to space that highlighted the intersecting identities of Puerto Ricans. I also cannot forget to mention the group of Puerto Rican women and other activists who stepped up to help the families and partners of victims and survivors by offering translation services and other means of support when the city was arguably not prepared to meet the needs of this growing community. Their actions challenged exclusionary practices and represent the refusal of this important facet of the Puerto Rican community to be silenced. Now, given everything that I've just said, is there more work to be done? Of course. For instance, one point that I heard time and time again is that we need to do more to help recent migrants understand the political process here in Florida. Are there challenges and tensions? Absolutely. In fact, several of my participants spoke about the competition for limited funding and the sometimes conflicting opinions among other activists and leaders in the community on how to accomplish common goals. But where I see the hope is that there were moments where those differences were put aside, even if momentarily, which I think is important to consider at a bipartisan event such as this, where many of us have different political stances and beliefs. In many ways, these examples uniquely express the demand for representation, visibility, and inclusion. They speak not only to the potential of the Puerto Rican community to work together towards the common goal of advancement, but also to carve out a space in Florida that is unequivocally theirs. So in closing, there's a quotation that I think is really fitting, written by a scholar of diaspora studies named Robin Cohen. He wrote, quote, "Diasporas tend to be messy and ragged at the edges," end quote. I think that engaging with the Puerto Rican community here in Florida, especially those who are migrating and those who are doing the work on the ground, like many of you in this room are, can help us capture those messy and ragged edges of everyday life. Thank you.